Colonel Michael Carter, a 72-year-old decorated veteran, had lived in the peaceful suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Estates for over 2 decades. Known for his morning walks, his immaculate front lawn, and his unwavering love for his country, Michael was a respected figure in the community. As the 4th of July approached, it was only natural for him to raise a large, pristine American flag on a brand-new flagpole in his front yard. The sight was breathtaking, a 10-foot pole with the stars and stripes waving proudly in the summer breeze. Neighbors admired it, and passing drivers slowed down to appreciate the patriotic display. But not everyone was pleased. Margaret Maggie Kensington, the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA, saw the flagpole as a direct challenge to her authority. The first warning came in the form of a neatly typed letter taped to Michael's front door. It read, "Mr. Carter, your recent installation of a large flagpole in your yard is in violation of HOA guidelines. You are required to remove it within 48 hours or face fines." Michael read the letter, chuckled to himself, and placed it on his kitchen counter. He had lived in this neighborhood long before Maggie had weaseled her way onto the HOA board, and in all his years, he had never heard of such a rule. He decided to ignore the warning. After all, this was his land, his home, and his flag. 2 days later, the second notice arrived, this time via certified mail. It was more aggressive. Final warning: your unauthorized flagpole violates HOA regulations, Section 12B. Failure to comply will result in an immediate fine of $100 per day, starting on the 5th of July. Michael sighed, shaking his head. "This woman has too much time on her hands," he muttered, tossing the letter aside. That evening, he called his old war buddy, Tom, a fellow veteran and retired lawyer. "Can she actually do this?" Michael asked. Tom laughed dryly on the other end. "Sounds like she's pulling rules out of thin air. Stand your ground." But Maggie wasn't done yet. On the morning of the 5th of July, Michael woke up to find a bright red violation sign planted on his lawn. Bold capital letters screamed, "Infraction. Fines pending." The fine had now jumped to $500, with an additional $500, with an additional $100 per day if he didn't remove the flagpole immediately. Neighbors walking their dogs paused in shock, whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads in disapproval, not at Michael, but at the sheer pettiness of the HOA. That evening, as Michael sat on his porch sipping a cold glass of lemonade, Maggie herself appeared. She was a petite woman in her 50s, dressed in a stiff, perfectly ironed pantsuit, her signature clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. Her short blonde bob barely moved as she marched up his driveway with the authority of a dictator inspecting her troops. "Mr. Carter," she began, forcing a tight-lipped smile, "I assume you received our notices." Michael leaned back, crossing his arms. "Oh, I received them all right." Maggie's smile faltered. "Then I assume you understand the consequences of your actions. HOA regulations are in place to maintain the uniformity and aesthetic of our community." Michael raised an eyebrow. "So, an American flag is somehow a threat to this neighborhood?" Maggie huffed, exasperated. "The issue is the flagpole. It's too tall. It disrupts the sight line, and it's not in compliance." "Karen," Michael interrupted, his voice firm but calm, "this is my property. I fought for this country, and I'll be damned if I let you tell me I can't fly the flag on my own land." Maggie's nostrils flared. "If you do not remove it by tomorrow morning, you will be fined $1,000. And if the fines aren't paid, the HOA has the right to place a lien on your home." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from pure, unfiltered anger. He had fought for his country, risked his life for the very freedom Maggie was trying to take away. And now, this paper-pushing tyrant wanted to steal his home over a flagpole. He stood slowly, towering over her. "You do whatever you think you need to do, Maggie. But let me tell you this, that flag isn't coming down." Maggie scoffed, stepping back. "You'll regret this," she sneered before storming away. As Michael watched her leave, a few neighbors quietly clapped from their driveways. The war had begun. Michael Carter knew a battle when he saw one, and this was no different. He had fought in 2 wars, faced real enemies, and stood his ground under fire. If Maggie thought a few pieces of paper and some fines would make him surrender, she was gravely mistaken. That night, he sat on his porch, staring at the flag swaying gracefully in the summer breeze, illuminated by the warm glow of the porch light. He had never felt more determined in his life. The next morning, Michael woke up to the sound of hammering. He pulled open his curtains and froze. A contractor hired by the HOA was in his front yard, attempting to remove the flagpole. Michael burst through the front door, marching straight toward the unsuspecting worker, who looked up from his tools in confusion. "Excuse me, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Michael demanded, his voice firm and unwavering. The worker, a middle-aged man in a safety vest, wiped sweat from his brow. "Oh, I was hired by the HOA to take this down. Said it was authorized." Michael's hands curled into fists. "Did they tell you it belongs to a United States veteran? That it's on my private property?" The worker hesitated, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Look, sir, I'm just doing my job." Michael cut him off. "Buddy, you're about to commit trespassing and destruction of private property. You touch that pole, and I'll have you arrested." The worker gulped, taking a step back. Clearly, he had not signed up for this kind of confrontation. "I'll call my boss," he stammered before hastily retreating to his truck. Michael watched as the man drove away, kicking up dust. But his victory was short-lived because Maggie was watching. She stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, lips curled in a smug smirk, like a vulture waiting to pick at a carcass. "You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be, Mr. Carter," she called out, her voice dripping with condescension. Michael turned to face her, his jaw clenched like a steel trap. "And you're making this a lot more personal than it needs to be, Maggie." Maggie let out a mocking laugh. "This isn't personal. It's about rules. This neighborhood has standards, and I won't let you disrupt that." Michael took a step closer, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "Maggie, tell me something. Why is it that every other house in this neighborhood can have holiday lights, garden gnomes, and fountains, but my flagpole is the only thing that suddenly violates your so-called rules?" For the first time, Maggie looked visibly caught off guard. She opened her mouth, then quickly shut it. "That's different," she finally said, grasping for control of the conversation. Michael smirked. "No, it's not. This is about you and your power trip. You don't like being told no, and you sure as hell don't like it when someone stands up to you." Maggie's cheeks flushed red, but she quickly regained her composure. "Well, Mr. Carter, since you refuse to comply, I'm afraid the HOA will be issuing additional fines. Expect an updated notice this evening." With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, her clipboard bouncing against her hip. But Michael was ready. That afternoon, Michael called his lawyer friend, Tom, again. This time, the conversation was all business. "She's crossing a serious legal line, Michael," Tom said, his voice grave. "First off, she has zero authority to fine you over a flagpole. Federal law protects your right to display the American flag on residential property. Second, she just tried to have it removed without due process. That's destruction of property. If she pushes this any further, you could have a solid case against her." Michael nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "Then it's time to fight back." That evening, as promised, Maggie delivered another fine notice, this time for $1,500. But Michael wasn't fazed. Instead of backing down, he did something Maggie never expected. He installed a second flagpole. The next morning, when Maggie stepped outside, she was greeted with the sight of two massive American flags fluttering side by side in Michael's yard. The neighborhood was buzzing, some in pure admiration, others laughing at Maggie's inevitable meltdown. And meltdown she did. Maggie stormed over, red-faced and practically foaming at the mouth. "What is this?" she shrieked, pointing at the second flag. Michael, casually sipping his morning coffee, grinned. "Oh, that's called freedom." Maggie's eye twitched. "That's called a direct violation. You're making things worse for yourself, Mr. Carter." Michael leaned in slightly, his grin widening. "You started this, Maggie. Now I'm going to end it." The neighborhood watched in stunned silence, realizing something monumental was about to happen. Michael wasn't just fighting for his flag anymore. He was fighting for every homeowner tired of Maggie's tyranny. And the war had just begun. The sight of two massive American flags flying boldly in Colonel Michael Carter's yard sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For years, many residents had quietly resented Maggie and her iron-fisted rule over the HOA, but no one had ever dared to stand up to her like this. People drove by, slowing their cars to admire Michael's stand against the HOA dictatorship, and neighbors lingered on their lawns, whispering among themselves. It wasn't just about the flag anymore. It was about defiance against unjust authority. Maggie, however, was seething. She had spent years meticulously crafting her position as the self-appointed queen of the HOA, ruling with an iron clipboard and an endless supply of violation notices. Now, Michael's public act of defiance was making her look weak, and the HOA board members were taking notice. That evening, as the sun set over the pristine suburban streets, Michael received an unexpected knock on his door. When he opened it, he found 3 of his neighbors standing there: Tom Willis, a retired firefighter; Lisa Monroe, a school teacher; and Greg Dorson, a small business owner. They all wore the same expression, part concern, part admiration. "Colonel," Tom said, tipping his baseball cap, "we just wanted to stop by and say we support you." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Support me?" Lisa nodded, stepping forward. "You're doing what all of us have wanted to do for years. Maggie's been abusing her position for too long. She's handed out ridiculous fines, shut down neighborhood events, and even forced families to repaint their homes just because she didn't like the color. But you're standing up to her, and we want to help." Michael leaned against his door frame, studying their faces. These were good people. People who had put up with Maggie's nonsense for far too long. "What exactly are you proposing?" Michael asked, intrigued. Greg smirked, crossing his arms. "A neighborhood rebellion." Lisa pulled out a stack of printed papers and handed them to Michael. "These are copies of the HOA's bylaws. We spent the last 2 nights going through them, and guess what? Nowhere in these rules does it say anything about flagpoles." Michael whistled low, flipping through the documents. "So Maggie's been making up the rules as she goes." Tom nodded. "Exactly. And it's not just about you, Colonel. She's done this to all of us. We think it's time we challenge her authority." Michael grinned. "Now that's something I can get behind." Over the next several days, something incredible happened. More flags started appearing. First, it was Tom Willis, who installed a flagpole identical to Michael's right in his front yard. Then, Lisa Monroe put up a banner across her porch that read, "This home respects those who served." Then the Dorsons, the Andersons, and the Martinez family followed suit. Within a week, there were over 20 American flags proudly displayed throughout the neighborhood. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a movement. Maggie watched in horror as her carefully controlled suburban utopia transformed into a patriotic battlefield. Every morning, she would drive through the neighborhood, her face contorted in rage as she saw more and more flags appearing on porches, lawns, fences, and even mailboxes. Finally, Maggie snapped. She called for an emergency HOA meeting. The invitation was mandatory, plastered on every resident's door, demanding attendance at the neighborhood clubhouse. The agenda: unauthorized decorations and community standards enforcement. Michael knew exactly what this meant. Maggie was going to try to force everyone to remove their flags. So he came prepared. On the night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. More residents showed up than had ever been seen at an HOA meeting before. Some were there out of curiosity, others out of outrage, but the vast majority, they were there to support Michael. Maggie stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, her thin lips pressed into a tight line as she looked out over the crowd. She was used to running these meetings with absolute control, but tonight, the power had shifted. She cleared her throat. "We are here tonight because of an ongoing issue with non-compliant homeowners who have deliberately ignored community regulations by installing unauthorized flagpoles," she began. A murmur of discontent rippled through the crowd. Michael, seated in the front row, stood up. "Maggie," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "I think we all know this isn't about flagpoles. This is about you abusing your authority." Gasps echoed through the room. Maggie's eyes narrowed. "That's absurd. I'm simply enforcing the rules." "There are no rules against flagpoles, Maggie," Lisa cut in, holding up the printed copies of the HOA bylaws. "We checked." Maggie froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The crowd erupted in whispers. Greg stood up next. "The real issue here is how many of us you've harassed over the years. How many people here have been fined for nonsense violations?" Nearly half the room raised their hands. Maggie stiffened, her grip tightening on her clipboard. She was losing control, fast. Before she could regain the room, Michael delivered the final blow. "This ends tonight," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "We're calling for a vote of no confidence in your leadership, Maggie." The room exploded into cheers. Maggie's face went pale. For the first time ever, she wasn't the one in charge, and she knew it. The tide had turned. But Maggie wasn't done yet. And her next move would take things to a whole new level. Maggie sat in her pristine white leather office chair, staring at her laptop screen, her fingers clenching and unclenching against her desk. The HOA meeting had been a disaster. She had never lost control like that before, never seen so many people defy her at once. It was humiliating. And worse, Michael Carter was at the center of it all. For years, she had kept the neighborhood in check, making sure it maintained its flawless appearance, keeping property values high, and most importantly, keeping herself in power. And now, this old veteran was rallying people against her, making her look weak. She refused to let it happen. She opened the HOA violation system, her mind racing. She needed to send a message, something that would shut this rebellion down fast. And then, a wicked idea struck her. If fines weren't enough, then she would go one step further. By the time the next morning arrived, Michael Carter was woken by the sound of loud voices outside his house. He pulled on his robe and stepped outside, only to freeze mid-step. His front yard was crawling with workers, all wearing bright orange vests, moving like an invading army. One was yanking out his mailbox, another was digging up his flower beds, and a third was climbing a ladder toward his flagpole. Michael's blood boiled. "What the hell is going on here?" he barked, his voice booming across the yard. One of the workers, a stocky man with a clipboard, turned to him, looking slightly nervous. HOA orders, sir. We've been sent to remove non-compliant structures and conduct a mandatory yard compliance inspection." Michael's fists clenched. "What compliance inspection?" Before the worker could answer, a familiar shrill voice cut through the morning air. Well, Mr. Carter. I see you're finally awake." Maggie stood at the edge of his driveway, her arms crossed, her expression smug. Michael took a deep, slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Maggie, what the hell is this?" he asked, gesturing to the chaos in his yard. "This," she said, "is a full-scale property compliance review. You see, when I dug a little deeper, I found that you've been violating multiple HOA codes, not just with your unauthorized flagpole, but also with your mailbox height, unapproved garden installations, and exterior lighting." Michael gritted his teeth. "That's bullshit, and you know it." Maggie tilted her head with an infuriatingly fake smile. "It's all in the bylaws, Mr. Carter. And since you refuse to comply voluntarily, the HOA is now exercising its right to enforce compliance. That means we can fix these issues ourselves at your expense." Michael's hands trembled with anger. "You're digging up my yard, destroying my property, and you think I'm going to let you get away with this?" Maggie's smile widened. "Oh, I don't think, Mr. Carter. I know." Michael took one slow step forward, his voice dropping dangerously low. "You come near that flagpole, and you'll regret it." Maggie's eyes sparkled with delight, sensing victory. "Oh, you mean this?" she asked, motioning to the worker already climbing up the ladder. Michael's heart pounded. The worker reached for the fastening clips, his hands grasping the metal pole. "Don't you dare!" A new voice cut through the tension like a blade. Everyone turned. Standing at the edge of the driveway was Tom Willis, the retired firefighter, and at least a dozen other neighbors, all watching in stunned outrage. Lisa Monroe stepped forward, her arms crossed. "Maggie, what the hell are you doing?" Maggie sighed dramatically, looking at them like they were children throwing a tantrum. "What I'm doing," she said, "is enforcing order. Maybe if a few people actually read the HOA guidelines instead of blindly following Mr. Carter's reckless rebellion, you'd understand that." Greg Dorson stepped in beside Michael. "Maggie, this is illegal." Maggie smirked. "Is it?" "Because according to the HOA charter, the board has the authority to carry out compliance enforcement actions when a homeowner refuses to correct violations." Lisa's jaw clenched. "Yeah, and when was that voted on?" Maggie's smug smile twitched. "That's what I thought," Lisa snapped. "You didn't get board approval, did you?" Maggie bristled. "I don't need approval for routine compliance." "Routine," Tom Willis barked. "You're tearing up a man's yard over a damn flagpole, Maggie." The crowd was growing. More neighbors were stepping out of their houses, watching in shock and outrage. Maggie suddenly realized she was losing control. Michael saw her hesitation and seized the moment. "You know what, Maggie?" he said, his voice booming so everyone could hear. If you really think you're in the right here, then why don't we call the police and let them decide? Maggie froze. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Lisa smirked. That's a great idea. Greg pulled out his phone. I'll call them right now. Maggie went pale. Michael stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. You see, Maggie, you didn't expect us to fight back. You thought you could just bully us into submission. But not this time. And definitely not me. Maggie's eyes darted around, her mind racing. If the police got involved, this could blow up in her face, fast. Finally, she snapped her fingers at the workers. Pack it up, she gritted out. The workers hesitated. Now, she shrieked. One by one, the orange-vested men packed up their tools and left, casting nervous glances at the enraged crowd. Michael watched them go, his hands still clenched at his sides. Maggie turned to face him one last time, her eyes burning with pure hatred. This isn't over, she hissed. Michael smiled. Oh, I know. But the next time you try something like this, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a near whisper, I'll be ready. Maggie spun on her heel and stormed off, her face burning red with humiliation. The moment she was gone, the entire neighborhood erupted in cheers. Michael turned to Lisa, Greg, and Tom. That woman is going to come back swinging, he muttered. Lisa nodded. Then we'd better be ready. And they would be. Because Maggie had just declared war. And she had no idea what was coming next. Maggie Kensington was boiling with rage. She had never been humiliated like that before. Not in her own neighborhood. Not in front of her own HOA board members. And certainly not by a group of defiant homeowners led by a stubborn old veteran. She spent the rest of the night fuming, pacing back and forth in her home office, gripping her HOA rulebook so tightly her knuckles turned white. This isn't over, she muttered to herself, her eyes scanning through the bylaws, desperately looking for anything at all, that would force Michael to comply. And then she found it. A single clause buried deep in the HOA's founding documents. A loophole that she could exploit. A way to take this fight to the next level. By morning, the entire neighborhood awoke to something shocking. An HOA eviction notice plastered in bold red letters across Michael Carter's front door. Underneath it, an official document from the HOA, signed by Maggie herself. Due to ongoing and repeated violations of HOA regulations, failure to comply with property ordinances, and refusal to adhere to neighborhood aesthetics, the HOA board is moving forward with legal action to foreclose on this property. The words hit like a bombshell. Michael stared at the notice, his hands tightening into fists. This wasn't just a fine anymore. This was an attempt to take his home. Within minutes, news spread like wildfire. Neighbors gathered in front of Michael's house, reading the eviction notice in utter disbelief. The entire neighborhood was buzzing. People on their phones, others recording video footage, some even calling their own lawyers. And Maggie? Maggie was watching from her porch, sipping coffee with the smuggest expression imaginable. She thought she had one, but she had no idea what was about to happen next. Because Michael had a friend in high places. By noon, an unexpected figure arrived in the neighborhood. A black SUV with government plates pulled up in front of Michael's house. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Mayor David Reynolds. Michael had known David Reynolds for years. They had met at a veterans fundraiser event years ago, and while they weren't exactly best friends, they had respect for each other. And now, Michael needed a favor. The moment the mayor stepped out, the entire crowd fell silent. Maggie, standing on her porch, suddenly went rigid. Mayor Reynolds took one look at the eviction notice, yanked it off the door, and turned to face Michael and the gathered crowd. This, he said, holding the document up, is absolute nonsense. The crowd erupted in cheers. Maggie, suddenly panicking, stormed down her driveway. Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, but this is an HOA matter, and you have no jurisdiction here. The mayor turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Oh, but I do, Miss Kensington, he said, his voice cold and authoritative. Because the state of your state has a law that overrides HOA regulations when it comes to flag display on private property. Maggie froze. Michael grinned. Mayor Reynolds held up a printed document, reading aloud. Under the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, signed into federal law in 2006, homeowners associations are prohibited from enforcing restrictions that prevent residents from displaying the United States flag on their property. The crowd cheered even louder. Maggie stammered, her confidence shattering before everyone's eyes. That's not applicable here, she started, but the mayor cut her off. Oh, it absolutely is, he said. And not only that, but you've also overstepped your legal authority by issuing this bogus eviction notice. Maggie's face turned white. The mayor turned to Michael. Colonel Carter, I'll be personally seeing to it that this entire situation is escalated to legal authorities. The HOA does not have the power to seize your home, nor can they harass you into submission. Maggie tried one last time to fight back. Well, I was just trying to maintain the standards of this community, she blurted out. Mayor Reynolds turned to her, his tone sharp as a blade. No, Miss Kensington, you weren't maintaining standards. You were abusing your power. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Maggie stiffened, realizing that things had officially spiraled out of her control. The entire neighborhood was against her. The mayor himself had called her out. And Michael was untouchable now. Maggie knew it. Michael knew it. And as the mayor left, shaking Michael's hand before stepping back into his SUV, the entire crowd erupted into a standing ovation. But this wasn't the end, because Maggie wasn't done yet. And what she did next would be her ultimate downfall. Maggie locked herself in her office, her hands trembling as she furiously typed on her laptop. The humiliation from the HOA meeting, the public shaming by the mayor, and the cheering crowd outside Michael Carter's house had pushed her to the edge. For years, she had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist, and now, her power was crumbling before her eyes. She couldn't let this happen. There was only one way out now. She needed to bury Michael Carter in legal trouble before the HOA board or law enforcement buried her. That night, she sent an anonymous report to the county zoning board, falsely claiming that Michael Carter had made illegal modifications to his property, a clear violation of local housing ordinances. She smirked as she hit send. Let's see how tough you are when the county comes knocking, Carter, she muttered to herself, satisfied that she had finally found a way to turn the tables. But Maggie had made a critical mistake. Because Michael Carter, he wasn't the one with something to hide. Maggie was. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to chaos. Michael had been served with an official notice from the county, informing him that a complaint had been filed against his property. The document threatened heavy fines and potential legal action if violations were found. Michael wasn't surprised. She's getting desperate, Lisa Monroe said, crossing her arms as they gathered on Michael's porch. This is her last move before she crashes and burns. Michael nodded, calm and collected. She wants a war? She's got one. What Maggie didn't expect, however, was that her own dirty secrets were about to surface. Because Tom Willis, the retired firefighter, had been doing some digging, and what he found would be Maggie's undoing. That afternoon, Tom arrived at Michael's house with a folder full of documents, his face set in stone. "Colonel," he said, handing over the paperwork, "I think we just found a way to end this once and for all." Michael took the folder, flipping it open. As he scanned the documents, his eyes widened. "Where did you find this?" he asked. Tom grinned. "Public records. It took some digging, but let's just say Maggie's been a very bad girl." Inside the folder were financial records, HOA budgets, and fraudulent transactions. Maggie had been embezzling HOA funds for years. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into a private account under her name, disguised as maintenance costs and administrative fees. But that wasn't even the worst part. There was another document, one that directly tied Maggie to a massive zoning violation. As it turned out, the very same county zoning board she had contacted about Michael had already been investigating Maggie for illegal property modifications to her own home. While Maggie had been cracking down on minor infractions, mailbox heights, exterior lights, flagpoles, she had been secretly expanding her own property, violating multiple housing ordinances. She had added a large sunroom and an unauthorized underground wine cellar without any permits or approvals. Michael let out a low whistle. "So she's been enforcing rules that she herself was breaking." Tom nodded. "And now, we take this public." The next morning, Michael walked into the HOA office with a mission. The moment he stepped inside, Maggie's smug expression disappeared. "Oh, it's you," she scoffed, barely looking up from her desk. "Here to beg for mercy?" Michael smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No," he said, placing the folder full of damning evidence onto her desk. "I'm here to let you know that your reign of terror is over." Maggie's brows furrowed as she flipped through the papers. As she realized what she was looking at, her face went pale. This is fake, she stammered. Michael crossed his arms. Really? Because I already sent copies to the HOA board, the mayor's office, and the county zoning commission. Maggie's hands trembled. You can't do this. Oh, but I already did, Michael said, leaning in slightly. And I imagine it won't be long before law enforcement does the rest. Maggie shot up from her seat, panic flashing in her eyes. This is harassment. I'll sue you for this. Michael chuckled. Go ahead. But you might want to lawyer up first. Because when the HOA board finds out that you've been stealing their money, and when the county charges you for illegal property modifications, he paused, letting the words sink in, you won't just be losing your HOA position, Maggie. You'll be going to jail. The downfall of Maggie Kensington happened faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours, the HOA board voted to remove her from her position. Within 48 hours, the county zoning commission issued an official violation against her property. And within 1 week, she was served with an arrest warrant for embezzlement and fraud. On the day of her arrest, the entire neighborhood gathered to watch. Maggie was dragged out of her house in handcuffs, screaming at the officers, shouting about how she was being set up, how it was all a misunderstanding. But no one felt sorry for her. Michael stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching as she was loaded into the back of a police car. Lisa turned to him. Well, I'd say that's justice served. Tom chuckled. And to think, all of this happened because of a flagpole. Michael smiled, watching as the police car pulled away. No, he said, shaking his head. It happened because she thought she could control everyone. Lisa nodded. And now? Michael looked up at the American flag flying proudly in his yard. She's gone. The flag stays. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. With Maggie Kensington officially removed from power, the neighborhood felt like it had awakened from a long nightmare. People who had once walked on eggshells in fear of her unfair fines and arbitrary rules now felt free. It wasn't just about the flagpole anymore. It was about taking back control from a tyrant who had ruled with an iron fist and a clipboard. Michael Carter, the man who had stood up to her, was now a symbol of defiance and victory. Neighbors who had once avoided confrontation were now standing together, united in a way they never had before. But for Michael, the battle wasn't quite over yet. A week after Maggie's arrest, the HOA board called for a special meeting, this time without her. Michael attended, expecting it to be just another formality. But what happened next shocked him. Lisa Monroe, the school teacher who had supported Michael throughout the ordeal, stood up before the room. The board has decided, she announced, her voice steady. From this day forward, we are abolishing all excessive fines, rolling back every unjust violation that Maggie issued in the last 5 years. She turned to Michael. And we'd like to formally apologize to Colonel Carter. Michael raised an eyebrow. Apologize? Lisa nodded. For everything. For allowing her to bully this community, for letting her get away with it for so long, and most of all, for what she did to you. The room erupted in applause. Michael stood slowly, feeling the weight of everything finally lift off his shoulders. I didn't do this for an apology, he said, his voice carrying through the room. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Maggie thought she could control people through fear, but fear only works until someone stands up to it. Tom Willis, the retired firefighter, stood up and grinned. Well, Colonel, you sure as hell stood up to it. The applause grew louder, and then Lisa pulled out an official document. There's one more thing, she said. We voted on it this morning. She turned the page over, showing it to Michael, a plaque dedication request in honor of Colonel Michael Carter, defender of our community. Michael blinked, stunned. What is this? Lisa smiled. We're renaming the neighborhood park after you. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had spent his whole life serving his country, fighting for freedom, justice, and honor. But he never expected to be honored in return. His eyes softened as he looked at the document in front of him. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Lisa smiled. Say yes. Michael chuckled, shaking his head. All right. But let's get one thing straight. If you're naming it after me, I want a big damn flagpole right in the center. The room erupted in laughter and cheers. Lisa grinned. Done. Meanwhile, Maggie Kensington sat in a courtroom, her face drained of its usual smugness. She had tried to fight the charges, But with the overwhelming evidence of embezzlement and fraud, her lawyers couldn't do much. The judge wasn't sympathetic. "Miss Kensington," he said, peering over his glasses, "not only did you violate state housing laws, but you stole from your own community. You abused your power, targeted innocent homeowners, and attempted to use legal loopholes to force a veteran out of his home." Maggie remained silent, her jaw clenched tight. "You are hereby sentenced to 2 years of house arrest, ordered to pay restitution to the HOA, and barred from ever holding another HOA position again." The gavel slammed down, and with that, Maggie Kensington's reign of terror was officially over. On the day of the park dedication, the entire neighborhood gathered at the newly renamed Carter Park. Michael stood in front of the brand-new flagpole, the largest one in the county, and watched as the American flag was raised high into the sky. As it unfurled, he felt something deep in his chest, a sense of peace, of victory, of justice. Lisa stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "this park is dedicated to a man who stood up for what was right, who never backed down, and who showed us all what real courage looks like." The crowd cheered. Michael stepped forward, looking out at the faces of the people he had fought for. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice strong and steady. "It's about all of us. This is a reminder that when we stand together, when we refuse to let bullies control us, we win." He looked up at the flag, feeling the warm breeze carry it high. "This flag stands for freedom, for justice, for the people. And as long as it flies, we remember that no one, not even an HOA tyrant, can take that away from us." The crowd erupted in applause, and as the sun set on Carter Park, Michael Carter sat on a park bench with his old friend Tom, watching the flag sway peacefully in the wind. "You know," Tom said, "I don't think Maggie's going to like seeing this from whatever apartment she's stuck in now." Michael chuckled, shaking his head. "She can look at it all she wants." He took a deep breath, looking out over his home, his community, his victory. Because that flag was never coming down. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.